Welcome everyone, or welcome back if you've been here already all day, and thank you for staying, or thank you for coming. I'm Zanna Gilbert. I'm a research specialist at the Getty Research Institute, and I'm one of the curators of Making Art Concrete. It's a really great pleasure for me to welcome Cecilia Vicuña tonight. We're really honored to have her with us to reflect on the discussions we've been having and we'll have tomorrow as well. It's a pretty tall order for anyone to respond to such a breadth of different talks and subjects and genres. But when we hit upon the idea of inviting Cecilia, we knew it was a good idea. And that's partly because her work deals very strongly both with what she calls the ancestral to the avant-garde. So she has a deep research in the art and thought and production of the ancient Americas, but she's also widely known as a contemporary artist and poet. Cecilia Vicuña's achievements and contributions as an artist, a poet, an activist, and a filmmaker are very many, and I won't take up time going through all of them. But I wanted to point out that her deeply committed research into indigenous knowledge spans both the academic and the artistic realms. Through her work, Vicuña addresses, in many ways, the disaster of ecological destruction. It reminds us of the precarity of our shared world and the intimacy of the connection of every being to it. She was born and raised in Santiago de Chile, and she went into exile in the early 70s after the military coup against Salvador Allende, then president. In Chile, she founded Tribunal in 1967, a group that created anonymous poetic actions in Santiago. In 1974, exiled in London, she co-founded Artists for Democracy to oppose dictatorships. She's a noted anthologist, as the editor of the Oxford Book of Latin American Poetry, 500 Years of Latin American Poetry, as well as a celebrated artist whose work has just this year been included in Documenta 14 and is the subject of the retrospective Cecilia Vicuña about to happen at the Contemporary Art Center of New Orleans, and it will also tour to other venues in the US. And her work can be seen here in LA as part of PST, as part of Radical Women at the Hammer Museum. Her visual art has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Santiago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I'm going to just lastly note that it's Cecilia's approach to materiality and the way an object interconnects with its surroundings that she will bring to us this evening, based on her exhaustive research in the art and thought of the ancient Americas. Thanks.
Salud. El poema es el animal hundiendo la boca en el manantial. The poem is the animal sinking its mouth in the stream. If you think a poem is just a poem, you are cut off from the spring. If you are cut off from the spring, drought ensues. La sequía persigue al poema. If you think the objects in the golden kingdom come from a worldview, if you think each one of them is an acknowledgement, a vehicle, a passageway to a different dimension of being. Un objeto no es un objeto, es un testigo de una relación. An object is not an object, but a witness to a relationship. Thoughts arise from the reading as little smoke spirals, as golden spirals. I was thinking of the Nahuarch, this Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a spiral you have on the cover of the book. Pectoral affixed to a cotton garment. It says pecto al pecho de dos espirales, dos pensamientos que se esfuman, espiralan, copulan, yéndose adentro a un sol adentro de sí mismo. These thoughts are like suns that travel inside themselves. Corazón que ilumina como un sol, a heart that illumines like a sun, a doble conciencia, espejo de sí. Their art was a contemplation, contemplating itself, saberse, sabiendo, saberse, sabiendo. I know I'm going to be cut off before I go through half the pages I wrote thinking of this moment. I think I am a messenger coming from two opposite worlds. I come from New York, I come from the US, where poetry means nothing, where billions are being spent to create an artificial brain to rule us. And I come from Chile, from an ancient oral culture where women have been the speakers of the language that speaks to the unknown, the language that crosses all boundaries with its murmur of life, its murmur of life that is love unheard. The two worlds live in me, in a mortal embrace that kills me with life. A brilliant friend said, colonization is the murderous jealousy of beauty. That was Julia Bryan Wilson. So we undo that colonization with every fart and every pee and every fuck and every breath if we can. And Kim Richter said the other day, why does it matter? Why does it matter to have this show called Golden Kingdoms? And the sages, the scholars refuse to give an answer. We don't know, they claim, as if we would be fooled by the answer when their entire life is dedicated to opposing the notion that is sinking the golden kingdoms. That's why I said I am going to answer, because I'm not being asked. I think it is because the earth is dying. I think it is because the indigenous worldview that produced this art is not gone. The conditions, says the scholars, that created the magnificent, of course they are gone, but the view is with us. Otherwise, you couldn't be in this room. But we're murdering it fast. Just coming here, I was reading a new word. It's called insectagedon. Insectagedon, like Armageddon. I suppose in English it could be insectagedon. I cannot say it. It is the killing of every insect on earth. Because we're not thinking that the insects come, the soil goes, the plants go, and we go behind them. los formadores de las praderas. The insects are working in the formation of the prairies, in the formation of the plants, say the embois of the Guarani rainforest. The wonders are vanishing before our eyes, says George Monbiot. So I say, what is that knowing that is available to us? We're only cut off from it because we think we are cut off. Resurfacing insurgent indigeneity, root music, impossible translation. It needs to be heard. It needs to be touched, to be caressed, to be alive. The nicest noise is when they go by without being read. They like that. Indigenous knowledge is like the dark cloud constellation. The Yana Huyu, the Yana Huyu. If it goes unnamed, unseen, you can massacre it. That's why my work was always focused on disappearance, on awareness of the disappearing us. Esa es nuestra fuerza para hacer futuro. We can only create future if we see with the eyes of a different time, a time that rejects the present. I wanted to bring together the notion of love and hatred, the notion of love and hatred that are at odds and at union with each other, because we need to prepare ourselves to jump into the complete void of not knowing who we are anymore in order to become who we need to become for the next phase. Transformation depends on the symbolic death, giving up what we think we are. Transformation is beauty. The works animated, the scholars say, not by illusion, but because something is living in them, a whole field of energy is activated in the encounter. Imagine an instant where all forms of attention are collectively gathering an invisible whipping of multiple gazes on a single focal point, as if this jaguar, this female jaguar, this poporo, Kalima poporo, it's alive when we're all focused on its leading force. Let's bring to mind that not far from here, in Arizona, the last jaguar, the last is roaming the mountains that call him El Jefe. Yet they want to build a mine in his grounds to kill the last jaguar, to kill the last one. In the Andes, people say, an image here, a textile sees. You don't put a mask to be seen, but to see with different eyes. It was Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov that heard that line from a co-gisage. But in the Andes, there's no word for beauty. A song must never strike a right note. You say quizá instead. The slow power to transform. El suave endulzar de una fruta secándose al sol. A slow drying fruit. Hate and anger becoming peace and love. The spectrum at work, the weaver says. A color gradation is an effort of light to unite shadow and light. The rainbow has a motor, they say. To weave gradations is to weave an illusion, un destello that heats the eye. Not to mystify with illusion, but to clarify the role of illusion in our perception of reality. Alango in Java is beauty, not a noun, but a god, a divine manifestation. Simultáneamente arrobado y arrobante, being in ecstasy creates this state. La evidencia metafórica de participatory universe. The universe of all living things, aware of each other. Aware, away, parece away, tejer in quechua. Awareness as a weeping. The electricity within atoms enables groups to join, making molecules. Bring enough of them together and they become self-aware as you read in this frank clauses. And I have to see how much time we have for me to know how much I need to skip. I know I'm performing a misunderstanding. What Lawrence Sullivan calls the mutual impenetrability of the sacred sources of meaning. That's why Emily Dickinson said, for occupation this to gather paradise. And I read that and the whole orgasmic joy arises. And when seeing this golden kingdom's thing, I enter instantly into a state solution to meet that beauty. We are all of us, not thinking, not saying, just feeling. Monbiot said the only thing that can displace the story, he meant the worldview that's killing the earth, is another story. But the indigenous view, the so-called indigenous view, says the ritual process of creating your own story communally with your body from the ground up. As if creating a new origin story grounded in love, in orgasmic joy, where our own origin story now. Think of that fucking word, origin, that we seem to place somewhere away from us. Open it up, and ori is the same word as orient. It means oriri, the coming out of the stars. Tonight is the full moon, and a whole group of people in LA are seeding the future of LA, planting native seeds in the bed of the old Los Angeles River at moonlight as it used to be. In the future, Angelino. In the future, Angelino. Maybe you say Angelino. How do you say it? Angelino? It's impossible to figure out that pronunciation. I was very, very touched by every piece of writing in das book. In that, look, I said it in German, das Buch. No. I was thinking in my mind in the fucking book, but you know, I had to fix it up. I had to dress it up, transform it. How do you say, put a mask on it, and it came in German. What can you do? Because it is this feeling of thinking of the language of El Reflejo. So you reminded me of a book that I published in the year 1990. I spent the whole 80s writing it. I could be writing it in Cusco, in Ollantaytambo, in Lake Titicaca, in Buenos Aires, wherever I went. I was thinking and thinking of this notion of the reflection. I was one day in Ollantaytambo, in the wrong mountain in Ollantaytambo, and thanks to the fact that I was there, I was able to see the temple from another mountain. And what I saw is that the temple had all these little channels that were shining, creating a weaving of light that you would only see if you are in the wrong mountain across the river. And when I saw that, I was turned on into this perception of the impossible that is totally possible if you find yourself what you're not supposed to be. So I wrote all these poems for the language of these reflections. So one of them is here. Let's see. We're almost finished according to the clock. Iridese. What whisk ancestral little hollow supreme membrane, race flashing blinding entrance, the same radiant things, tiny shadow they are, turning iridescent, illustrious black lips, shine again, little white glimpse, on a light prismal pool, offering the iris visual bow. Dark is the fountain shining black. And it is looking at those reflections. If I hadn't had that experience, how on earth could I know what is meant by gold? Why on earth did they use gold? One of the great things about your Golden Kingdom books is that it begins with a fairy tale, tragic story. If you had not been part of the story and you were just reading it in a book, I wish I could tell it to you like I read it, beginning with the account of a trading raft. Joan Pillsbury calls it the first tantalizing clue. That day in 525, of the ghost of Tumbes, a little raft loaded with gold and emeralds, traded for a few colored shells, this bounty loose. I have all these pages of thoughts about that, but I am looking at the clock, and you will have to find them in another song. I am sorry for that. For the Muisca, the goal was more closely associated with religious rituals than with displays of states, of status and power, says Maria Alicia Uribe and Marcos Martin. Joan says, gold, in gold there is the symbolic association of all metals, because gold contains silver and copper. And unfortunately I have to go. But I wanted to tell you that faced with the word luxury, I turned it around in the 60s to make a new word called luxume. This was my rebellion against the idea of luxury, Luxume es el lujo de ser sí mismo. It's the luxury of being necesito decir que mi atavío natural son las flores. Aunque me vestiré de un modo increíble, con plumas, dientes de loco y manojos de cabellera de Taiwán y Luxumé. Cada vez que estornudo se llena el cielo de chispas, hago acrobacias y piruetas endemoniadas. Cada noche me sale una espalda adyacente. Soy de 4 patas, preferentemente. Las ramas me saldrán por la piel. Estoy obligada a ser un ángel con la pelvis en llamas. And I will have to skip most of it in English, but just for you to get the feeling, I must say that my natural attire is flowers, even though I dress in an incredible manner, with feathers and teeth of crazy men and handfuls of long hair. Each night I grow an adjacent back. I am preferably on all fours, sprouting branches from my skin, like she is sprouting that kind of mushroom, which is the cosito para pegarle al poporo. Think of the image of what that does to you. That's how they go into the poporo to catch the line, to put it in the mouth. Branches from my skin and I demand to be an angel with my pelvis in flames. I almost said in pain. That's because I'm an old woman now. I didn't mean it that way. I meant the pelvis in flames, de puro calor, de pura belleza. And so the luxury art in this moment is truly being alive. Alive, I said, look at that, being alive. I wanted to tell you another gold story about the light hitting me, but I am concerned that this is the time. Gold is the vision of connectivity and responsiveness. El habla de la luz. Responsibility is the ability to respond. In the Andes, people say that those who don't take responsibility while being alive to their place in the cosmic exchange, they become condenados, lost souls. For the beauty of the exchange is the core of the gift of indigenous thinking. But indigenous to me is indigenous to humaness, is indigenous to el lugar que no es lugar y da lugar a un lugar más real que lo real, un modo de sentir, pensar que ha perdurado miles y miles de años, 70,000 años o más. How to say that in English doesn't seem as real as in Spanish. It comes from a place that ceases to be a place in order to give place to something that is more real than reality, a way of thinking and feeling that goes on for thousands and thousands of years. The destruction was colossal in scale, Joan Pillsbury said. Seguro que sí. Reminding us of the fragility of cultures, of the fragility of life, the fragility of life. But yet, nobody knows who that phone is. Is that you? That's nice. We could dance a little dance to it while we think of this wonderful thought Lawrence Sullivan, quoting the people who study the Canelo, says they assess their dismal station in terms that are sacred to them, because they expect their own meanings to prevail through the disastrous experience of the present, while the other side has done the opposite. We have used our historical vision of time to eliminate the relevance of our contemporaries by outdating them, thinking of this as if it were in the past, as if it was, when in truth, in actuality, it is. Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala said to write is to weep, as if the act of writing would provoke a flood, a cleansing primordial power arriving to cleanse cosmic corruption. The conquest a Pashakuti. A chaotic transition is still going on, still going on. That's why the antidote is this line, which I will mispronounce. Teoquitlatl, Teoquitlatl, in Caustic, in Istak. That is supposed to be now. Of course, I don't know how to say it. Divine excrement, caca divina, caca del culo señorial de las alturas, de los infiernos, the yellow, the white. God is the shit of the sun, God. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Brilliant, iridescent, natural phenomena, water, rainbow, sunset, flames, stars, metal, feather, shells, belong to a sacred reality that could, that's the trouble, that can be invoked through song and ritual. If you say that was, think of that destructive power of that was. The hidden epistemological violence that prevents us from learning the miraculous continuity of this view in the living communities. And I have to skip all this passion for gold that resulted in the devastating loss of native traditions and lives, as Joan Pillsbury says. I have to go fast, thinking of arriving a la more efficace at this notion that these works were considered, look at that were efficacious. I have to say they still are active agents essential for the maintenance of the blessings. The idea of efficacy has never left, except the ritual vessels are not the objects alone. They are the whole community, the whole valley becoming the ritual vessel. And this is so if you have been to the rituals where everything melts and you are feeling el lujo de la basura, la caca del oro, el lujo de lo precario. There is the hint in the book that luxury is experiential. Yes, it is. The role of resistance, yes, it is. Luxury as being alive, not an exchange value, but the value of the exchange. El resplandor del oro. It's time to finish, so I will finish with one image, again picked up by Rael Dolmatov. He says that every now and then the people of the Sierra Nevada, the Kogi, would bring out el oro para solear al oro. They're sunning the gold. But the purpose is not to energize the gold, but energize the sun that will see its light reflected. So it's really the dialogue of light with itself. It is the reciprocal exchange, the awareness of the awareness that keeps the whole thing alive.
Going to play the video now. It's a little less time.
Yes.
Thank you, Cecilia. We're going to play a very short video, and then after we'll have a question and answer for Cecilia. The video is just 5 minutes. Perhaps we could just start by saying that the film is called Khipu Mapocho, and could you tell us a little about that project, and then we'll open it up after.
Okay. Gracias, Zanna. Yeah, this film was done in January of this year, and it's part of a larger project that is called Khipu Mapocho. Mapocho is the river that is born in that waterfall that I showed you. The reason of this work is that Chile has privatized its water under the dictatorship, but it has been ratified by the so-called democracy that we have now, and there is tremendous drought, and because of global warming, the glaciers are disappearing, so there's a lot of trouble with the water. And it so happens that, you know that I have worked with Khipu all my life. I have been doing Khipus for 50 years, but a moment came when the Khipus started to happen in the landscape, following a pattern of the Khipu Seke. You probably know that the Khipu has a virtual meaning a mind, imaginary counterpart, which is the Seke, which is a sort of, let's say, imaginary Khipu that has its heart in Cusco and extends in 41 directions. And the southernmost knot of this Khipu is El Plomo, the Plomo Glacier, where the Rio Mapocho is born. Therefore, a Capacocha child was buried alive at the summit of this mountain that I am doing the work with. And this child was buried alive, and he had 2 little bags of a scrotum, the scrotum of the llama, and inside those bags there was a little bit of red thread. And even though I had been working all my life with red thread, especially in the ocean and around the water, I had no idea of this fact. When I learned that, of course, the whole meaning of my work and my life devoted to Khipu and to the work around water took on a completely different meaning. So this is just a fragment of a larger work that has been performed by me with a number of people for 4 years in Chile.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Do the songs come to you in your dream state? And are they recitations that you remember from your ancestors?
I wish I knew how to answer that. I am indigenous on my mother's side, yet my mother and my grandmother were trained in bel canto, and they had no idea they were Indians. And so when I was born, I was always wearing feathers as a kid, but my mother was very much an Indian in the sense that she thought that cloth was very malignant. So no matter how cold it was, we would always be naked. And so it is, I have these amazing images of being, a baby naked in the sun, in adoration of the sun. So when my mother and my grandma tried to teach me to sing in bel canto, I was hopeless. I can't carry a tune. And so it was determined Cecilia is no singer. So very good. And I'm an old woman. I am in my 30s, and I am in front of the Holland Tunnel where all the tracks come from New Jersey into New York, and suddenly this song comes to me. This terrifying, weird song. And I'm crying, and this song is coming forth. What is it, And I remember at the time I was studying with Alan Lomax. Do you people in the room know who Alan Lomax is? And he was explaining that there is something called the melodic matrix. And it is a way in which people for thousands of years have shaped their inner parts of their mouth to create certain sounds. So it's pretty clear to me that there is a melodic matrix that is at work in each one of us. So this melodic matrix is the one that carries the memory of song of the ancestors inside of you. So just as the authors of the book are thinking that material has an aliveness, an animation, a composition of energy in it, the same is with our voice. Our voice is not a voice, it's something else, it's a composition, it's a creation that has been given to us by thousands of people living and dying. So yes, it comes to me in my dreams, it comes to me when I talk to you, it comes to me when I swear, fuck you, it comes to me at all times. Do you notice that I keep coming here? But this is dead. I suppose I like the dead.
So I ask a question? Cecilia, so I wanted to ask you, is when you started to work in the 1960s and you were not only doing poetry, but you were doing already a form of intuitive performance. Since the very beginning, you had this, I would like to call it intuitive approach to this idea of this kind of indigenous kind of root to this kind of creative force you have. But I guess you say you've been developing, working on the idea of the Khipu for 40 years. And then, so how has this idea evolved over time, in a combination of something that was born as a kind of a necessity, as a curiosity, into this kind of life force that is, pervaded not only in your poetry, your singing, your performatic work, your movies, your photographs, the objects you produce to become this kind of organic, thing in your work. So in other words, because if you think of the 1960s, this investigation you started is not very usual. It's very unusual.
Okay, the sound in your mic was not very clear, so I think you're asking me how did this evolve? Okay, yes, and I think also getting back to the Golden Kingdoms, there is a suggestion somewhere that there is a sort of accidental survival. And I really think that I am an accidental survival because when I was born at one of the few intervals of peace in the very violent history of Chile. My family had been persecuted for many generations, but when I was born, nobody was being persecuted up until the military coup that happened when I was 24. So I grew up in a real paradise, in the countryside. I grew up naked, as I say mostly, playing with the animals, and nobody was controlling me as a child. And I think this is very important, that I was trained by the animals. I was taught to sing by the animals. I really spent my life in the countryside until I was 9. At 9 o'clock, I was going to say, at 9, I was removed and taken to the upper class neighborhood of Santiago, where I was made fun brutally, instantly. And to this day, I'm still made fun of in Chile, because it's a class thing, that even though I do not belong to the working class, I belong to the upper educated middle class, my ways of being were never in tune with that class, because I had been left alone playing with the animals, you see. So I was a sort of a natural decolonizer from the beginning, because I never believed this world where you are supposed to be trained by Catholics and so forth. I was completely immune to that, And so my home was a foam, yes, it was a foam full of books in many languages. And nobody said to me, this is painting, this is a sculpture, this is poetry, this is music. You see, I just felt all of it. And therefore, all of it was available to me. How? It's inexplicable. I suppose it's the result of not being controlled, of not being directed, of not being told this is so and this is not so. Plus, in my family, there were many women artists. And the women artists, they all had the kitchen here, the studio there, and then the kids right there. So I grew up in this notion that the transformation of life and the transformation of art, the transformation of the experience was something continuous, was continuous with life, with daily life. And so by the time my father discovered that I was one of them, he wanted to kill me, tried to remove art from the little Cecilia. I was 12. I was already a poet. I was already an artist and no way back, So how to explain how this evolved? Of course, because I had access to such an extraordinary library, at age 14, 15, I was reading Lao Tzu, I was reading surrealist poetry, I was reading these amazing thinkers, You know, in the 60s, in the mid-60s, the extraordinary center of dispersion of translation was Buenos Aires, and books were very cheap, and we were swimming in books in the 60s. This is perhaps impossible to imagine when you think of how Chile is now, completely controlled by a policy that makes books so expensive that very few people read, you know. And so I grew up in a reading life, but surrounded by animals. I think that's the combination. Does that help?
I was also interested in the indigenous aspect of it. You know, because the Khipu, development 40 years old project of Khipus is like an unusual thing. I mean, I learned about the Khipus when I was, I don't know, in my late 20s or something. And I didn't really, you know, so...
Yes.
You know, what I'm interested in is kind of very unusual research you started in such an intense way that it's, I don't know, you know,
I will tell you two things, if that is the specific question, that helps me. One of my aunts was Rosa Vicuña. And Rosa Vicuña was a magnificent artist. She is completely forgotten in Chile or anywhere else. And she created clay sculptures about this big. You know, she was completely into the tectonic language of abstract monumental clay, which is really a woman's indigenous art. You know? And at the same time, the comics that arrived in Chile in the 50s and 60s were, for example, Mexican comics, and they would be comics with pre-Columbian histories, pre-Columbian legends and myths. So I think I was turned on into the indigenous by the cowboy films, because I took the side of the Indians, by the comics, and by the studio of my aunt. I am sure I read about the Khipu in her home, because she had a library. She had a library where I could see pre-Columbian art. And why did that little girl get turned on by pre-Columbian art? It's inexplicable, because you're completely right. Nobody was turned on by pre-Columbian art. We didn't have museums of pre-Columbian art. It just wasn't available anywhere. But the minute I learned about the Khipu, my first Khipu was a virtual Khipu, was a mind Khipu. I had never heard of Seki. I learned about Seki like 30 years later. But I wrote in my notebook, and I still, if you go to my archives, you can find the original note, El Khipu que no recuerda nada, the Khipu that remembers nothing. So if you ask me, it's like the imaginary field of the Khipu was seeded as an image to the whole of the Inca world. And Santiago was definitely part of the Inca world, you see. And so this Inca world, this imagination, is completely alive in the land. And the whole of my work, if you look at it from the perspective of today, it looks like an attention to how this memory seems to percolate up once there is a person that has the antennas and the feeling for it. And you can only have the feeling for it if you are empty, if your mind is naked of thought. And this nakedness is what made my poetry erotic. And I know you know my erotic poetry of the 60s. My erotic poetry of the 60s is still censored in Chile. It still has not been published in full. Why? Because this nakedness of the mind, of the female mind, is still outrageous, you know. And this is its power. And it's, if you think of it in reverse, the fact that this is still like a virginal outrageousness is something immense, you know.
I was wondering if you could tell us about your research and connection with the gold artifacts in the objects in the exhibitions. I know you have a history of having worked with those, some of those pieces on a project of your own.
I lived in Colombia for many years when I was young. I went to Colombia for a short visit, and I ended up staying 5 years. So I suppose what I experienced in Colombia was a total transformation of my perception, and it was like a bodily transformation, because in Colombia, I don't know if any of you here has been in Colombia. I suppose a few of you have, and if you have had this experience that when you arrive in Colombia, there's something that I call ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. There is a sort of sound, there is a sort of beat, there is a sort of pulsation. And so part of this is that the aliveness of the local cultures has never been overrun by the culture of the state or the culture of the dominating cultures. So it is the experience of the light, the experience that I encounter of gold there is what really enlightened me. Not only just the objects themselves, but what the Kogi have to say about gold. You see, and when you read people like Reichel Dolmatov, I know he's considered now to be a Nazi, but Nazi or not, he had one gift, which is he learned the languages and he heard the sages, you know. And for example, there are many things he could say that things like this, that when they did the Minga is the collective work, that is to say, all of us decide that we're going to go till the land. That's when they dressed in gold. So it's not just for the state and the power and the prestige. It is when you're shining also. And of course, there is Arguedas, and that's one of these pages I had to skip. When Arguedas, who was also a listener, he could listen to the workers on strike. The workers on strike would say, estamos brillando, hay una gran luz en nuestras vidas. So the notion that when the people bring their minds together to become one, they shine, that is the core of the indigenous idea. It's an idea of the self, of an idea of being, and that is the true luxury, if you ask me, that vision. And when that vision emerges, as it emerges during the time of Allende, it's really an indigenous idea that is transforming the world. And that's why perhaps it has to be suppressed with such violence, because it's the only counter, the real counter to the ruling worldview that we have now. You know?
I think that's a very pertinent place to leave it. Thank you so much.